you are still dangerous. You can be my wingman anytime.
Bullshit. You can be mine.
Hey guys, welcome back to Rewind Reviews. Before we get started today, I just have one question. Do you feel the need? The need for... It's Top Gun. We're doing Top Gun today. Released in 1986 and directed by the late Tony Scott and co-written by Jim Cash and Jack Epps Jr., the movie sees a daredevil Navy pilot played by Tom Cruise accepted into Miramar's elite fighter school known as Top Gun, where the young pilot has to compete with the best of the best, including Iceman, who's a brilliant and highly competitive fellow student. Still haunted by his father's untimely death, Maverick works to prove his worth not only as a pilot but to Charlie, the flying school's no-nonsense astrophysics instructor, as he competes to suppress his wild nature and win the prestigious Top Gun trophy. When it comes to this movie, it's one of those movies that is like a classic 80s film. It's something that you get told to watch all the time. It is hailed as a classic in many different aspects, and I've never really watched it until very recently. It isn't necessarily one of those films that you get told that it's a must watch, you have to see this movie. It's one of those ones that is sort of around, it is usually put within like top 180s movies, but it's nowhere near the top. And I never really felt like a desperate need to actually see this until the new movie came out. I'll also gladly admit that I'm a big fan of the Mission Impossible movies, and seeing the helicopter sequence in Mission Impossible Fallout, it really did get me interested a bit more, because I'm thinking like, well, if this is what they're able to do with helicopters, then what on earth are they able to do with planes? So now that I've actually watched it, would I put it in like the top 100 80s movies? That's kind of complicated. So starting off with the cast for this movie, this is a pretty impressive cast, especially for a movie back then. We've got Tom Cruise, we've got Val Kilmer, Anthony Edwards, kellymcgillis, Tom Skerritt, Meg Ryan, James Tolkien, Tim Robbins, Asian Pasdar. It is pretty impressive, so I can understand why a lot of people were quite interested when this originally did come out. Obviously the big star of this movie is Tom Cruise. Like he's the headliner for this movie, and this is definitely one of his better films. It's definitely one of his better performances. Even though I do feel like the character is very cliched in many different ways. You know, he's cocky, but he's a genius, he's a daredevil. Of course, he is reckless, and all the stunts he's able to perform in his planes, like where he's like flips his plane upside down and the goose is taking pictures of the other pilots. But of course, like, he's haunted by his past, and it sort of interferes with his life and how he sees the way that he is as a pilot. It's been done before many times. It's okay in this one, you know, it doesn't bog it down too much, and I do think that it does work quite well for this film. We've also got a pre-Batman Val Kilmer in here, and honestly I quite like the way that they've handled his character. You know, he's meant to be like the rival for Maverick, you know, Iceman, and it works quite well. I do think that the chemistry that those two characters do have is really good, and I do think that the way that Val Kilmer does perform this role is really good. I'll also admit that this is kind of one of the few times where they've got like that sort of antagonistic character who's kind of got a point, where he's like saying that, you know, Maverick is reckless and he's quite dangerous and all sorts of stuff. Well, based on everything that we've seen so far throughout the film, I kind of agree with him, but you're not supposed to like him. So the one thing that he seems to keep doing throughout the entire movie, I don't think there's a single scene where he stops chewing. It's so annoying. I went to high school, people were doing it all the time, all you just hear is... What you're going to find with me in this review is I did find it quite corny, and I did find it quite funny at times, even though there are some pretty serious moments and they are handled well. But the overall sort of cheesiness to it did sort of catch me off guard a little bit, just how cheesy it actually was, to the point where I did find it quite funny. It's very much a product of the 80s, you know, it's got like that sort of 80s sort of feel to it. Even Meg Ryan's in it, so definitely an 80s movie. I can see why, especially a lot of movies that came out afterwards, they draw a lot of influence from it, whether it was like just a little homage here or there, or if it was just like a full-on spoof. Full disclosure, my introduction to Top Gun was through Hot Shots, and that is a really good parody in the way that it's able to kind of tell its own story, but now that I've seen Top Gun, I can understand where a lot of those influences came from, because it is one of those movies that is genuinely a very easy target to spoof or parody in some way. Oh, can you imagine if it came out within like the past few years or so, and you get Adrian Pasdar to come back in and like, everyone takes off in the planes and he can just like fly, and it's just because like he was able to fly in Heroes. He doesn't need a plane. God, nobody talks about Heroes anymore. Moving on. When it comes to the rest of the cast for this movie, everyone is genuinely really good in their roles, and I do think that most of them are, they're not too fleshed out. The only ones that are really sort of like focused on like the marketing, like Tom Cruise and kellymcgillis, they're kind of the ones that the movie kind of revolves around. It makes sense because like they are the ones that are sort of primarily focused on, like especially like the posters. But everyone's presence is quite welcome in this, even though I don't feel like they're all as defined as I think that they probably could have been. Like, you probably wouldn't be able to tell most of them apart because they all have very similar quirks and personalities. I do find it quite funny that James Tolkien's in this, and for anyone who isn't aware, he's the guy who played Strickland in Back to the Future. So it was quite funny seeing him pop up in this because I didn't realise that it was just about a year or so after Back to the Future had come out. He plays a very similar character, so it was quite a nice surprise seeing him in this. When it comes to the overall story for this movie, I think that it's good, but I feel like there's not really an awful lot to it. It's partly a love story, it's partly an action movie, but there's no real sort of stakes to it in a way, and I think that it is very cliched. I think a lot of the cliched stuff kind of comes a lot from the love story between Maverick and Charlie. It's handled well, and I do think the performances that both actors are giving is good, and I do buy it, and I do think that the chemistry between them is really nice, but it is very by the numbers. You're not necessarily rooting for them to get together by the end of the movie. In all honesty, I was more rooting for Maverick and Iceman because I just think that their chemistry and their story just seems to work a lot better for a love story. I'm not the only person who thinks that, but it's fine, and we do get a really nice song from it, even though that song is played ridiculously too much in this film. It's like every single time there's any sort of slightly romantic moment in this film, on it comes, and it's just like, can you not keep putting it on? I like the song, it works well for the movie, but anytime it's just like a little look that they give and then take my breath away, just stop it for a little bit. But when it comes to the action sequences, like all the flight scenes, they are genuinely pretty good. And I think it's a mixture of real performers along with, I'm not sure if they use like models or anything like that, but I don't think the actors were necessarily actually in the planes. It's just the way that it was shot, it just didn't seem like that was how they were doing it. But it's just the way that it was filmed, it just didn't seem like this was genuinely happening. It did sort of feel like they were maybe in a studio, but I could be wrong. I know in Maverick in the second movie it is all real and it looks so much better, but I do think that it works quite well, and I think that it allows the actors to really sort of do their thing without getting too distracted by like so much G-force on them. Those sequences are genuinely really thrilling. I do think that the stunt work is pretty well, it's done pretty well, and there are a few little shocks here and there which again, if you're sort of familiar with the story in any sort of way, you're probably aware of like the most shocking moment of this, and it is handled well. And I do think that when it comes to that moment in the story, everything does work very well, including the performances, and it is one of the best parts of the movie. You know, even though the ADR's a bit iffy in that scene, it's just so strange that when I actually listen to it, because it doesn't even sound like Tom Cruise like, during that sequence. It could be just me, but it doesn't quite sound right.
Go! Go! Oh no! Oh! Oh god! Oh god! Oh god!
Most of it is shot pretty nicely as well, especially like a lot of the flight sequences. When it comes to a lot of the more stuff that's down on the ground, I do think that there are a few scenes that I think that they could have shot maybe just a little bit better, because there are sequences where I don't know if it's just the version of the movie that I had or whether this is genuinely how it was released, but it's all in widescreen. For some reason it means that there's scenes where like the top of people's heads are sort of cut off because of the way that it's just sort of moving. I just think you could just tilt it up just a bit more just to get like the headline in, because it just looks really strange. But one of the reasons why I'm saying it is shot very nicely is that there's a really nice consistent colour scheme throughout this as well. There's lots of contrasting oranges and blues. Like it seems to be almost like permanently set during like sunsets. So there's a lot of like silhouettes and shots like that, and like a really nice orangey sort of look to it. and then a lot of the nighttime sequences are all blues, and it's just, it is a really nice contrast, and it does look quite nice. I do feel like I do need to mention the volleyball scene, because it is one of the iconic scenes of this movie, and it is kind of random, it is slightly out of place, but it just sort of adds to the fun of it, and it is a pretty fun scene, which weirdly brings me on to my next question. Why is everyone so sweaty in this? There's a lot of scenes where it's even just like people just hanging around, especially like on the aircraft carriers. They're just covered in sweat, and it just looks so strange. It's very much added on, because it doesn't quite look natural. Like, nobody's sweat is as like bulbous as that is, but I don't know. It's just a really strange thing that I just sort of picked up on, and yeah, that was one of the things that sort of made me unintentionally laugh, because I was just thinking, you've got towels, just use them. In terms of the actual Top Gun stuff in this film, I think I was quite surprised actually finding out that Top Gun's actually a real thing. So like when you see like the opening sequence, it's got all the text sort of explaining what Top Gun is, I thought it was made up. I thought it was just made for the movie. It was just like a plot device. But I've sort of looked into it, and Top Gun is actually a proper thing. It is an actual school, and apparently people do sort of quote the movie quite a lot, to the point where apparently they have a $5 fine if you start quoting it. Harold Faltermeyer provides the music for this movie, and it is very much an 80s style theme. It's very synthetic, it's very synthy, it's got that sort of like mixture of like rock pop kind of thing. It's quite similar to things that you'd hear in things like Stranger Things and things like that. But it sounds great. It is instantly iconic. It's very recognisable. Like, even though I hadn't seen the movie up until quite recently, I knew the themes. I recognised the music because it is so well known. It really works well for this movie. It does get your adrenaline going during the flight sequences. It sounds great. It does fit the tone of the movie, and I really do like what Harold was able to do. Plus, this is one of those classic 80s movies that does have a pretty iconic soundtrack when it comes to the songs that they use throughout the film, because there's so many that you will definitely recognise, but you may not necessarily know that they're from this film. You've got things like Take My Breath Away and Danger Zone and Sweet Balls of Fire, and all those songs do work really well. I do like how they are incorporated into this film. None of those songs feel out of place. The only one that I do have any sort of issue is Take My Breath Away, because they do play it every opportunity that they can, and I do feel like they could have just sort of held off on how much they did use it. I do like the song. I do like pretty much all the songs that they do use throughout this movie, but it's just a case of just using it when it's genuinely necessary, and that's my only real complaint with the soundtrack. When it comes to my feelings overall for this movie, I think it is good, and I do think that it is genuinely worth a watch, but this is quite a divisive thing to say. I don't necessarily think that this is a must-watch movie. I think that people will probably find it a little bit cheesy and a little bit of its time, but it is genuinely good, and I do think that it is worth a watch. I can genuinely see why people do love the movie, and you know, I did try to get on board with it as much as I could, and I did come away liking it, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it was one of my favourite movies. Overall, it is a fun action flick. Its heart's in the right place. It does have a lot of passion that does come through on screen. There obviously is a lot of people who did care about what it was that they were trying to make. It is good. It's not great, but it is genuinely enjoyable, and I do think that it is worth a watch. So with all that being said, my rating for this movie is going to be a 7 out of 10. Honestly, I had fun with it, and I do think that if you do watch it, I'm sure you will have a good time too. That's all I've got to say for today's episode, so thank you so much for watching. Please like, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for any old movies that you'd like me to take a look at, or anything new that's coming out that you want me to have a look at and do a review for, let me know down in the comments. I'm going to be doing a review for Top Gun Maverick. That's going to be coming out very soon. It might even just be like a couple days after this is released, so just keep an eye out for that one, or if you're looking from the future, then it should already be up on my channel. So as always, thank you so much for watching if you watched this far, and I will see you next time on Rewind Reviews. See ya.